Interview techniques, psychiatric history, mental state examination, obviously a very important topic, right? Because you will be doing this throughout your posting in psychiatry, especially when you go to the clinical side. So you need to be aware of all the steps. Largely, history taking is very similar to what you have been learning in other subjects, but at the same time, there are quite a few differences. So we'll talk about all those things. Interview techniques is the reason they have given this separately, quite apart from what you are used to in medicine and surgery or whatever, is because setting the scene is very important in psychiatry. So what do we mean by setting the scene? First of all, you have to make sure that safety is ensured. Ultimately, it's about everyone. Everybody's safety is important. But first of all, it's your safety as a clinician, as a doctor. Okay, because only if you are safe that you can do the other things, you can do your job. If you are being threatened or you are under duress or there is some harm that might befall you, then you can't work. It's quite simple as that, right? It's a bit like when you travel by flight, they make an announcement, the safety announcement right at the beginning, right? In case of low oxygen levels, the mask will drop. And if you are with a child, make sure that, what do they say? Wear the mask yourself first before you attend to the child, right? If you are unconscious, you can't attend to the child. It's as simple as that. That's the reason for that, right? So similarly, if you are not safe, or if you are being assaulted by the patient or relative or whoever it is, you can't function. So your safety comes first. Then, of course, you have to attend to others' safety as well, including the patients and the relatives and safety. Ultimately, everybody's safety. That is a key word here. And the reason for that is in psychiatry, especially in emergency situations, it can be very unpredictable. You never know what is going to happen at what time, you know. So you have to be very, very careful. Especially if you are seeing somebody new who has been admitted or brought in with a history of violence, is very agitated, angry, irritable, or whatever. You have to be extremely careful about safety issues. So how do you ensure that you are safe? It doesn't have to be something like a gun or something, because we are not law enforcement people. We are medical people. Even a pen can become a weapon if it is available to the patient to use. If you are wearing a tie, that can become a weapon. He can strangulate you with the tie. Right?
Yes.
Glass pieces in the interview room. If there is a glass, he can use that. So these are the issues that you should think about before you see the patient, actually, not while seeing the patient. You have to be clear about safety issues before you see the patient. So make sure that these objects are not available within arm's reach when you go there to interview the patient. And make sure that the door is kept open so that you don't get locked in the room with the patient, right? Difficult situation you will be putting yourself into if you do that. Make sure that somebody is aware that you are going in to see the patient, like somebody who is outside, staff nurse or security or whoever it is. If necessary, you take the security person with you, right?
Yeah.
If it is too much of a threat, make sure that there is somebody there with you. It may be a security person or a police officer. Then once you enter, make sure that the door is, as I told you, it is left open. Or the other feature of the door that is required for safety issues is that there is a window on the door. The reason for this is because people from outside can see what is going on inside, right? If the door is solid, opaque, completely locked, and you are being strangulated inside by the patient, who will know? Right? So the door should have a window, and you should go in with some kind of personal alarm, like a bleep or something like that, that you can set off if you feel you're being threatened or you are in danger or anything, so that people can come running and save you. These bleeps and these alarm systems are there in secure, there's medium secure units or secure units where forensic psychiatric patients are kept. So these are the safety issues that you should think about. So as you can see from what I have described, it is your safety as well as others' safety. Setting the scene includes, first of all, safety. So you have to make sure that it is in place. What about the environment and the ambience? Yeah, see, once you have taken care of safety, then you start thinking about other things which will make your interview process or the history taking process as smooth as possible, and something that puts the patient in a comfortable position, in a good mental state, to be able to reveal the full history to you. Okay, so that begins with the environment or the ambience, by which we mean it should be a private place. It should be like a room. You cannot do psychiatric history taking in a corridor where everybody is walking up and down the corridor. You understand? Because of confidentiality issues, and the patient will not feel comfortable revealing personal issues to you in the corridor. So it has to be in a confined space, a private space such as your office, which is locked, and comfortable seats, and make sure that the temperature is neither too hot nor too cold, and you also have some tissues at hand, because things can get very personal and emotional during history taking, and frequently there may be crying spells from the patient. So tissues to make use of during such times. So this is what we mean by a good environment to facilitate disclosure by the patient. That's what it is. And of course, the next step is what to do with the patient himself or herself. So then you start putting the patient at ease by not talking about the psychiatric issues straight away. By which I mean, if somebody is coming in crying, you can't straight away say, "No, at least seems that you are depressed. Can you tell me more about it?" You might want to begin in a different way, like building up rapport, for example. Rapport is a big thing in psychiatry. Rapport means the relationship you share with the patient. Interpersonal relationship, the quality of interpersonal relationship, that's what rapport is. And if rapport is good, that will facilitate information gathering. If the rapport is poor, patient will clam up and will never reveal anything. Okay, so you might want to begin by putting the patient at ease by talking about the weather, for instance. Talk about something different, something non-threatening. Talk about how he traveled to the place. Talk about his family, right? And try to be as empathetic as possible. We'll talk about empathy a little bit later on. So rapport is, as I've mentioned there, that's the next thing. That's very important. The relationship, the quality of the relationship that you share with the patient, that is rapport. It will facilitate disclosure and good history taking. Okay. And this taking notes bit, I know it might sound very easy if you are working in medicine or surgery or OBG or anything, because automatically you will take notes while you're talking to the patient, right?
Yes.
But in psychiatry it is a lot trickier. And the reason for that is eye contact. One of my consultants always used to say, maintain eye contact with the patient. And again, it gets trickier. if you have understood that it is a non-threatening environment, or if the patient is not agitated, then maintaining eye contact is important, because that will show a few things. One is that you are paying attention to the patient, right, by looking him into the eye, and also you will get a clearer picture of the patient's thoughts and emotions as he or she speaks. Okay, but the other situation is where patient is highly irritable, has already threatened you. In that case, would you like to maintain eye contact with such a person? I doubt that very much.
No.
The analogy for this would be very similar to what would happen if you are being chased by some wild animal,
Run.
or the wild animal is confronting you face to face. Do you think making eye contact with the animal is a wise idea?
Run, sir.
It's not, right? So you have to, they say that you just have to put your head down like this and look away as much as you can. So that will tell the wild animal that you are not, especially wild dogs, that you are not threatening the animal in any way. Animals will attack you if they feel threatened. So if you show through your body language that you are not trying to threaten them in any way, they will back off. You understand?
Yes.
So very similar to that is a person who is completely psychotic, antisocial personality, who is highly dangerous, making threatening gestures, very irritable. In that case, probably better to avoid eye contact and use non-threatening body language and words. Try to calm him down as much as you can verbally. Okay, so taking notes is a tricky thing in psychiatry. If you feel that the rapport, the previous point, the rapport is good with your patient, then maybe you can just once in a while look down at your sheet of paper to jot down the notes. The patient will be okay with that. But if you feel you are in a situation where the patient needs your full attention, and he or she may take offense to you looking away, then probably better not to take down the notes while you're talking to the patient. And pay full attention. Remember what you have discussed, and immediately as soon as you finish the interview, write down the notes, because writing down the notes is extremely important in psychiatry. Imagine you are the consultant and you have a junior doctor with you, and you can tell the patient straight away as soon as you go that my junior here will be taking notes and we'll be having a discussion. That is also acceptable. Okay, that's also another method of doing it. But if you are alone, just be sure about whether it is appropriate for you to take down the notes straight away, or should you wait until you finish the interview. But make sure that you write down the notes as soon as you finish the interview, because you can't rely on your memory. It has to be written down when it is fresh, because your notes have to be extremely accurate. You should not miss any point.
Yes.
The longer it remains in your memory, the more likely you are to forget certain key aspects, and maybe even false memories will come into the picture. So it will all get very complicated and inaccurate. That you should avoid, because your notes are extremely important in psychiatry. In the court of law, they will be admitted as evidence later on if things go wrong. You understand? So you have to be very careful about documentation. It's called documentation. It's highly important in psychiatry. Okay. Interview techniques, moving on, still with interview techniques. Obviously, assessment, right? That's what we do. When a patient comes to you, to the OPD or wherever you are, you do an assessment. Assessment includes history and examination. And examination includes mental state examination as well as physical examination. Please remember that psychiatric history proceeds in a certain order, but while you are seeing the patient, you can take down or take the history from the patient verbally in any order. Because you can't tell the patient, I'm going to begin by some demographic, taking down demographic details. What is your name, age, sex, occupation, address? Right, so now we are moving on to presenting illness. So what is your main symptom and how long have you had it? Right, next we'll talk about your past psychiatric history. We can't do that, right?
Yes.
The patient, you remember, he or she is very disturbed, under duress. They are emotional, they are anxious, they may be irritated. They have come to you to talk about their problems. So the interview has to proceed according to, at least initially, according to how the patient wants to talk. Okay, so the patient may well start by talking about our family first. I'm living with my husband, and I have 2 children, and my mother-in-law is visiting, and she may begin by starting about these issues because that is very relevant to her, right? You can't interrupt the patient and say, actually, that comes under family history, so can we talk about that later on? So let the patient begin in his or her own way. You can take the history in any way, but while you are writing the history for presentation, it has to be written in the proper order. That's very important. Okay. So while you are writing the history, change the order to put it in the proper sequence. And of course, that sequence applies when you are presenting the case history in your examination or to a senior or whoever it is. What about mental state examination? So just like you have physical examination, like systemic examination, RS, CVS, or abdomen, CNS, all those things, we have mental state examination. The mind is examined thoroughly using certain steps. And usually in medicine, after taking the history, we'll put the patient on the couch and we'll start doing general physical examination and systemic and all those things, right? So does it have to be like that in psychiatry?
No.
No. Again, it can be in any order. Mental state examination may happen before you take the history. And the reason for that is mental state examination begins as soon as you see the patient entering the room. Because appearance and behavior is one of the first steps of mental state examination. So the moment you see the patient, you're already assessing his or her appearance, facial expression, clothing, and all those things. And
Yes.
as and when the patient interacts with you, the mental state examination will continue throughout the interview. The next contentious issue in psychiatric history taking is about collateral history. You know what collateral history is, right? The history that you take with the patient's attendants, relatives, friends, could even be his general practitioner if you are the specialist seeing the patient. It could be the police who has brought the patient in. Could be any one of these, right? Do I talk to the relative first and then the patient, or should I talk to the patient first and then relative together? Again, it depends on the situation. If a violent patient, I won't go and talk to him straight away, right? You might want to find out as much information about the patient before you go to see the patient. Before you do all those safety checks and all the setting the scene and all that, you might want to find out as much information collaterally about this violent patient before you go and see him. So that would include talking to the relative, talking to the GP if he knows anything about this violent behavior. If the police have brought him, you might want to talk to the police. You might want to talk to the staff nurse in the emergency ward to find out how he has been behaving, how he interacted with them. All this is part of collateral history, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, but sometimes in other situations, patient will say, all the things that I'm going to say are confidential. I don't want you to discuss this with anybody, not even my family. So in that case, you might want to see the patient all alone, right? And If you are still in doubt about something, then you might want to say to the patient, listen, I know you told me that whatever you have said is confidential, but there are certain clarifications that I need to make with your family. Is it okay if I just ask them a few questions? And then you can go and talk to the patient's relatives without disclosing what the patient has told you. You can just say, I'm here to ask some questions, but I can't tell you what the patient has told me because he or she doesn't want me to disclose any information. Okay, there are limits to confidentiality also, meaning you can't just listen to everything the patient says and say that, yeah, this is confidential because he has asked me not to tell it to anybody. Therefore, I'm not going to say. What are these exceptions to confidentiality? Risk aspects, risk to self or others. If a patient divulges to you saying that just after this interview, I'm going to go and commit suicide, but I don't want you to tell this to anybody, can you listen to that and keep quiet? You cannot,
No.
right? Because your role as a doctor is to preserve
Safe.
life and keep everybody safe. So you have a larger duty towards the patient or the society, and therefore you have grounds to breach the confidentiality and go and disclose it to the right people. You don't have to go and tell it to the whole world. You might just want to tell it to his closest relative or the police. Suppose he has threatened somebody, I'm going to kill such a person. You might want to tell it to the police first and to that person also who he has threatened. So these are the exceptions to confidentiality. But other than this, it's better you maintain the patient confidentiality. So collateral history, the purpose of talking to the relatives is to gather more information about the patient. Please also remember that if you talk only to the patient, there may be certain aspects of history which may be totally unreliable or even false. So you have to corroborate that information that you have gathered by talking to another person who knows the patient well. That is the other purpose for taking collateral history. This happens especially in psychiatry. Patient may be completely delusional and say, somebody entered my house yesterday and they tried to attack me. Right? He may be psychotic and delusional. You have to corroborate that later on, right? You might want to ask his wife, is it true that somebody entered the house and threatened to kill him? If she says yes, then maybe it really occurred. If she says no, then he's probably delusional. So you have to corroborate the information given by the patient. Moving on to questioning style, the way we question patients. In medicine, we never really bothered about these things, right? But in psychiatry, it's a big deal. So ideally, we should begin the interview by beginning with open questions. What do you mean by open questions? Yeah, anything that elicits an explanation as a response is an open question. On the other hand, anything that elicits yes or no as a response is a closed question.
Closed questions.
You understand? Suppose I ask the patient, are you feeling well today? The answer to that question is either yes or no.
Close
Right?
question.
So that will become a closed question. On the other hand, if I reframe that question and say, how are you feeling
How are you
today?
feeling?
So that demands an explanation from the patient. Right? So that should ideally be the opening questioning style. What brings you here today? How are you feeling today? What is the problem? All these require explanations from the patient because we want to hear from the patient's words as much as possible what he or she thinks is the problem. So ideally begin with open questions. When do you use closed questions? When do you use them?
Detail.
When the patient is rambling and going on and not coming to a point, right? So that is also not serving your purpose, right? You want to clarify something. Patient is going on and gone in a circumstantial way. including unnecessary details, which often happens with psychiatric patients, I have to say. Then you have to bring the discussion back on track by asking closed questions. Can you just stop you there, please? Because I need to clarify certain things. You said that you were not living in this town last year. Is that correct? So that's a closed question, right? Yes or no? For clarifications, you might want to use yes or no type of questions, but begin with an open question. Moving on to polythematic questions. What are those? It's what it says. Poly means many. Thematic is many things. Lots of themes in one question. Where were you last year? Where were you employed? And what was your relationship with your colleagues? Why did you leave the job? Too many questions in one question. That is very, very confusing. This is often seen with news anchors. Have you seen them? They're asking polythematic questions at all times because they want to cover too many points in one question. They end up asking polythematic questions that will only confuse the listener. So please avoid asking polythematic questions, especially a person who is disturbed, mentally retarded, or anxious, irritable. You can't ask too many questions straight away. Keep the questions simple. How are you today? What did you do in the past? Do you have any medical problems? Keep it simple. Then, of course, as I told you earlier, summarizing or checking understanding is very important so that you don't get anything wrong. Patient will be rambling on. There may be false memory also in what the patient is saying. He or she might have missed some important point. He or she might have exaggerated something. So you have to summarize by saying, a little while ago you said that you were not in this town, but you were working somewhere else, and the environment was not good for you. You felt very anxious. Is this correct? So you have summarized and you are asking whether you got the information right or wrong. But also, if you are explaining something to the patient, on the other hand, like you are explaining why you have to give the patient antidepressant medications, and you have told everything about the medication, then you might want to stop and say, I have told you all these things. Do you understand what I have just explained to you? Are you okay with what I have explained? Do you want to ask any questions? Do you have any doubts about the side effects of these medications? So that is why you are explaining, checking understanding. Summarizing can be either when you are taking history or when you are explaining something. Okay. Verbal cues. A cue is something which triggers the response from another person. Quite often seen in dramatics. When you are rehearsing for a drama, once your dialogue ends, the other person will have to begin the dialogue. Or once you do certain gesture, the other person has to say something. So that is a cue. You understand what I'm saying? So sometimes a patient may be stuck due to whatever reason. He or she may just clam up and not reveal anything. So then in that case, you might, or even to encourage the patient to continue saying whatever he or she is saying, you might want to give verbal cues such as, yes, I'm listening to you, carry on, I heard you, that's interesting. Something like that, to show that you are interested, you are listening, and to facilitate the patient to continue talking to you and revealing the information that he or she is revealing. Clear? So what is the difference between sympathy and empathy? Sympathy is expressing your concern and care, your solidarity to the patient, or anybody for that matter, whenever he or she is undergoing a difficult time, such as saying things like, I'm very sorry that this happened to you. Are you feeling okay? Is there anything I can do to help you? So that is something called sympathy, where you're just expressing your concern to the patient. Whereas on the other hand, empathy goes a step further. It is like trying to understand what the patient is going through or what anybody is going through, putting yourself in the person's shoes to understand what he or she is experiencing. And of course, this goes to say that if you have already experienced the problem that the person is experiencing, then it's easier to empathize, isn't it? Because you understand what the nature of the problem is. Sympathy is the show of concern that you do towards anybody. If he or she is having a problem, you might say things like, I'm sorry this is happening to you, and I'm there for you to help you in any way I can. Those sort of things. So that is sympathy. Whereas empathy goes a step further and tries, and this is a situation where you try to understand what the patient or anybody is undergoing. So if you have already had that experience, it's easier to empathize. But still, as a professional, especially in psychiatry, you might want to try and put yourself in the patient's shoes as much as you can to understand what he or she is undergoing. So that is empathy. But of course, there is a limit to this. Empathy does not, you can never empathize fully because you just don't know what it is to have schizophrenia, for example. If you have not been depressed before, you just don't know what it is to be depressed. So you cannot empathize to the full extent. There is always a limit to it. And also, the other problem is that there is a danger of you becoming over-involved with the patient. By which I mean being just too concerned to the point of being emotionally involved with the patient, becoming personally involved in the patient's affairs, completely identifying with the patient's problems. That should not happen. So that goes against the therapeutic relationship that you have with the patient and may be counterproductive to both you and the patient. So extreme empathy is not advised. Sympathy, progressing to empathy as much as you can to try and understand the patient's problem, that is what is required. So that is, empathy should be put into practice in any therapeutic relationship, and it is also one of the things that builds up the rapport that we discussed earlier. Do you understand? So this is the order of history that you have to write in. You can take the history in any order, but make sure that you write the history in this order. First, demographic details, which is the same as history taking in medicine or surgery. So you might want to include details such as name, surname, age of the patient, sex, address, seen with, that's very important. That's the next one. Seen with collateral or collateral informant, you have to mention right at the top of your history taking sheet just to show whether you spoke to the patient alone or you have already corroborated what the patient has said by talking to an informant. Each time we see a patient, even if it's a follow-up patient in the OPD, we always write seen with. Or if the patient is alone, I write seen alone. Because it's important to know whether the patient gave the information himself or herself, or there was somebody else adding to the information given or corroborating what he or she is saying. So the demographic details have significance. Name is the identifier, right? Age is important to know because certain conditions are more common in certain age groups. For example, schizophrenia is a disease of the second and third decade when it first comes on. Depression is slightly older, it's more prevalent among 40s, 50s decades. Dementia is more common after 60 years of age. ADHD is seen more in children, although there can also be adults with ADHD. Gender is important because certain conditions are more common in certain genders. Generally speaking, anxiety disorders are more common among women, except maybe OCD, which has equal sex incidence. Alcohol dependence, as I told you or any drug addiction for that matter, is more common among men. Address is important because certain areas may be prone for certain kind of mental illnesses. Inner city areas, high levels of drug abuse, high levels of schizophrenia as well. People from higher socioeconomic areas, more commonly associated with obsessional compulsive disorder. Bipolar disorder affects more of the people from higher socioeconomic strata than lower. Job information, you might want to find out what the occupation of the person is in demographic details. Certain professions or occupational hazards for certain psychiatric events. People living in the armed forces or the police, they are high risk of suicide because they have easy access to lethal weapons. Firearms, for example, the police have access to that. Among doctors, anesthetists are high suicide risk. They have access to lethal drugs, anesthetic agents. I've known people who have committed suicide by injecting themselves with succinylcholine and paralyzing themselves. Models, big risk for anorexia and suicide. Adolescents, big risk for sexual deviation, drug abuse. So age group matters as well as the profession also matters. Marital status also you might want to know, right? Single, married, divorced, separated, live-in. Being separated is a risk factor for suicide. So that's the importance of demographic details. So just by taking those details, which are very simple to obtain, you can know about so many things. Obviously, the next thing is history of presenting illness. You might want to note down what is the main problem of the patient and for how long. So that will be in chronological order. Then you go about writing about each of these symptoms or issues in detail. Yeah. So if, for example, if the patient says low mood, I'm feeling very sad, you will start asking questions about all the depressive features, such as low mood, worse in the mornings, loss of energy, anhedonia, that is loss of interest in previously enjoyed activities, biological features such as sleep disturbance, which is usually early morning awakening in depression, loss of appetite leading on to loss of weight, loss of libido in both the sexes, loss of menstrual cycles. These are all the biological symptoms. Presence of psychological symptoms such as feeling hopeless, worthless, helpless. Presence of suicidal ideas or deliberate self-harm ideas. So depending on the presenting complaint, the nature of your questioning will change and should include all these details. So for low mood, you go about asking questions about features of depression. So for that, do you understand what I'm trying to say here? Depending on what kind of features you want to cover, you need to be aware of the diagnostic features of each of these conditions. If you know the diagnostic features from DSM-5, for example, about depression, you can ask all the relevant questions about depression in the history of presenting complaints. That is why it is important for you to know, to ask the right kind of questions. Suppose somebody comes with a history of strange behavior, being suspicious, you might want to cover all the diagnostic features of schizophrenia in your history taking, is it not? And remember that once you ask about depressive symptoms, you have to screen the patient for presence of anxiety symptoms, because the two may coexist. Depression and anxiety often coexist in the same patient. So all this should be covered under history of presenting illness. Past psychiatric history would include details of previous illnesses, any similar or different kind of illnesses, whether the patient was admitted, did the patient receive psychotropic medications, if so, for how long, Were there any side effects? Did the patient have ECT in the past, which will indicate the severity of the previous condition? Because you need to know whether it is a recurrence of the same problem or if it is a different kind of problem that is presenting to you now. Medical history is, because the mind and body are connected, obviously we can't leave out medical problems. So you have to ask at least basic medical history, such as presence of hypertension, diabetes, epilepsy, very important, because that can have psychiatric ramifications, heart disease, respiratory disease, renal disease, liver disease, whatever, everything, whatever is relevant. Thyroid disease, again very relevant to psychiatry. So all these things you might want to make a note of. But of course from there you have to ask medication history after that, right? Because patient may be taking ACE inhibitors for his hypertension. That may interact with whatever you may prescribe. Thiazide diuretics, contraindicated if you want to put the patient on lithium. If the patient has depression and you are thinking of giving him or her fluoxetine, you might want to warn the patient if he is already taking other medications by saying fluoxetine is an enzyme inhibitor, therefore it can affect the levels of the other medications that you are taking. Please talk to your physician about this. So the drug interactions, very important. Therefore you have to take the medication history, whether the patient is already taking psychotropic medications or medications for other medical illnesses. You might want to note all of those down and think if they are going to interact with whatever you might be prescribing. Next is drug and alcohol history, wherein you go about asking about all the substance related history, such as alcohol, smoking, cannabis, psychoactive substances, opioids, cocaine, hallucinogens, injectables, very important. If there is a history of injectables, please remember that if you are seeing a patient whose presenting problem is alcohol, excessive alcohol use, then you have to put the whole history in history of presenting illness. You understand? Because that is the presenting illness. Whereas on the other hand, if you are seeing him or her because of any non-substance related illness like depression, schizophrenia or whatever, that will go in presenting illness. And in drug and alcohol history, you also ask about any substance abuse. Because in psychiatry, substances, especially alcohol, can also be a long case. So in that case, you record all substance related information in history of presenting illness. Family history is next. And as you can see there, it's called genogram, isn't it? This little figure that you draw to indicate the relationship of the patient with the family member. Square indicates male, circle is female. If you put a question mark in it, it's gender unknown, right? Pet is supposed to be like a diamond shaped. Adopted child is blue dotted lines. Okay. Foster child, that is somebody's child being looked after by foster parents, but not adopted, that is the difference. That is green dotted lines. Pregnancy, triangle. Okay. Pregnancy crossed out twice is miscarriage. Pregnancy crossed out 3 times is abortion. Death is crossed out, square or circle crossed out within the square or circle. Twins, 2 lines coming from the main line and indicating the gender, square or circle, but the 2 lines are joined together to show that they are twins. And if the square and circle or 2 squares or 2 circles are joined themselves, it is identical twins, monozygotic twins. Got it? So this is the structure of the family tree. And in psychiatry, it's better that you indicate this tree, build this tree at 3 levels. at the level of the patient, one level above, that it means including information about his parents, and one level below the patient, which includes information about his children. So at the level of the patient, you might want to include his siblings, brothers and sisters, and his wife or partner or whoever it is. We need at least 3 generations, one below, one at the same level, and one above the patient's level. You can indicate the patient by putting a arrow mark under any of these squares or circles to show that that is the patient. And under each of these squares and circles, you can write the age of the person, and also you can write any diagnosis, medical or psychiatric issues that the person may be having. You can indicate all that in the chart, the genogram itself. How do you indicate divorce? Upper line which joins the male and female, you have to cross out that line twice.
Parallel lines.
Yeah, put a cross across that line. So that will indicate the divorce or separation. Okay. Death, you can either cross it out or color it fully in black. So that may indicate death. So this is the genogram. But what is the detail of family history that you might want to write, not indicate pictorially? What will you write? You might have to talk about the relationships in the family. How good is the patient's relationship with his father, for example? How good is his relationship with his wife? Is it good or bad? If it is a good relationship, you might consider including that person as a co-therapist to help the patient in the therapy. If the relationship is very bad, which is causing frequent problems for the patient, you might want to advise him to interact minimally with such a person. Presence of any family history of illnesses. Somebody in the family might have schizophrenia in the first degree relatives, mother, father, siblings. Closer the genetic relationship to the patient, higher the chance of developing schizophrenia. So that is very important, isn't it? Runs a family history of illnesses. Relationship with illnesses. These are main things that you might want to include in the family history. Personal history would include details right from the childhood to the present age. What kind of childhood it was, happy memories, bad memories, any untoward incidents, such as growing up in a dysfunctional family, any history of abuse, how is the schooling history, did he or she get along well with students, other students, friends, teachers, any warnings in the school, suspended from school, how is the academic performance, good, bad, failed frequently, which will indicate whether the person has mental retardation, if a person is failing frequently in school. Did he complete school, go on to college, performance in college, academic, sports activities, extracurricular activities, was he good on that? Pre-illness features of schizophrenia can include things like being clumsy or incoordinated in motor movements. So that means sports performance may be very poor. These are things that you might want to check in early history. Then moving on to completion of education, the person completed the education or not. Jobs held, type of job, how long, relationship with colleagues, relationship with superiors, bosses. If the person left the job, did the person leave by his own plan? Did he resign? Or was he fired because of some misbehavior? Financial status, living on the roads, does he have a house, rented house? How much expenditure? All of this comes under personal history, which as you can see is entirely different from personal history that you take in medicine, for example. This is a lot more detailed. You might want to know everything about the personal details of the individual right up to the present point. I have indicated developmental history in brackets there is because if you are seeing a child as a patient, Then you have to take a detailed developmental history. So starting from the mother's pregnancy, was she exposed to any medications, toxic substances? Did she have any pregnancy-related illnesses? Any depression or psychosis during pregnancy? Exposure to psychotropic medications or harmful substances during pregnancy? Birth complications, if there were any? Did the baby cry at birth? Was it healthy, normal, pink in color? You know the ABGAR score that you do in pediatrics? Whether the child was managed in the neonatal ICU for any reason. Breastfeeding, immunization, any early childhood illnesses. All these things have to be asked in developmental history. Moving on to any history of developmental problems, any milestone related delays, delay in sitting, standing, walking. The most important milestone in psychiatry is speech. At what age did the child start to speak? If it is delayed, it may indicate autism. Speech is delayed or the development of speech is very poor in people with autism. It may also indicate mental retardation. Did the child play well with other children or was it very isolated? Did it do any odd behavior such as rocking movements, taking apart toys, destroying them, trying to see what is inside the toys? All this is very autistic behavior. Any problems in play school when the child was put in the play school? Right up to main school. So that will be developmental history. From main school onwards, the personal history begins. You understand? And don't forget, in childhood history, always check for untoward incidents such as growing up in dysfunctional families, which will have a psychological effect on the child's mind. And more importantly, history of abuse. Abuse is of various kind. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, which is hitting, emotional abuse such as victimizing and blaming the child, comparing the child with others constantly, or neglect, which is not taking care of the child, not feeding when hungry, not taking to a doctor when the child is ill, not bathing, those sort of things. So child sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect, the 4 types of abuse, very important to cover in childhood history. Psychosexual history would include details about the first menstrual period, menarche, puberty related changes in both the sexes, and first sexual experience. Was it with a known person, unknown person? Then the sexual deviances and sexuality, whether it is gay, straight or bisexual, sexual preference, that is, sexually deviant behavior such as transvestism, transsexualism, paraphilias, all these things. We'll have to include all these things in psychosexual history. Sexual relationship with the current partner, single partner or multiple partners, which would indicate a risk of pregnancy or sexually transmitted diseases. So all these things are important in psychosexual history. And you might also want to ask about the bearing this has on the overall mental condition of the patient. Whether the sexual relationship or the sexuality, if the patient is comfortable with that or not, whether it's causing any adjustment related problems or anxiety or depression or confusion, whatever it is, you might want to include that also. Forensic history, as I told you, it's the junction between crime and mental illness. So you might want to ask about any crimes committed in the past or recently, any assault on people or on non-living things such as properties, vehicles, or whatever. Any arrests, any jail time, any trials in the court of law, any convictions where he or she was found guilty, and whether he or she was sentenced and served a prison time, or if it is an adolescent, any remand in the juvenile home. All these things would have to be asked in forensic history and record the details. If you have any forensic report from some other place, you might want to record that as well. What is premorbid personality? Premorbid, morbidity is a disease process, isn't it? So it's before the disease process. Before the patient became depressed, what kind of a person he or she was. Was it very lively and extroverted kind of person? Which would indicate a big change if such a person became depressed, right? Or if a person was miserable, sad to begin with, it's not too much of a change if he or she becomes depressed. So you might want to include the nature of the personality, whether extroverted or introverted, outgoing or not, fun-loving, prefer to remain on his own. Political affiliations also can be recorded, religious affiliations, relationships with close members of the family or friends. All of these can be included in premorbid personality so that you can understand where the patient is coming from. That is, you can understand the pre-existing mental state of the person, which will help you understand the current mental state of the person. Mental state examination. So that's the next step after history. Yeah, as I told you earlier, after history, first step is under mental state examination, appearance and behavior. So the moment you see the patient, your mental state examination has already started. So in appearance, you might want to note down facial expressions. What is the look on the patient's face, the dress. Somebody with mania may be dressed very inappropriately for the weather or for the circumstance. So maybe somebody may be in revealing clothes or wearing a sweater during summer or hardly any clothes in winter. So this incongruity in dressing may be seen in mania or in schizophrenia. Somebody with schizophrenia may be wearing a cap. They may be wearing a mask because they are scared to reveal themselves. Kerchief on their face or something. Behavior is also very important because he or she may be showing various kinds of behavior towards you, such as friendly, irritable, agitated, threatening. Can be any of these. Over friendly or over familiar behavior is seen with somebody with hypomania or mania. Excessively friendly, talkative, cracking jokes, acting as though they know you from a very long time, even though you're meeting them for the first time. That's seen in mania.
Yes.
Somebody may be very guarded, suspicious, not revealing a lot. That may happen in schizophrenia. Somebody may be very downcast, avoiding eye contact, looking down, not revealing much. Happens in depression. Children are often very scared or shy to talk about anything, especially if you see them alone. So you have to put them at ease. So this assessment of appearance and behavior is very important, and you would include other things like rapport also within this appearance and behavior. What's the rapport that you share with the patient? The nature of the relationship that you had during the interview. Friendly, unfriendly, irritable, all those things should be recorded. Whether the information was that the patient gave you, was it voluntary, was it forced, coerced? Did you have to encourage the patient a lot to reveal the information? Did the patient avoid making eye contact, or did he or she was comfortable was he or she making eye contact? Moving on to speech. You might want to see how free-flowing the speech is, the speech stream, Spontaneous speech, guarded speech, halted speech. Then what is the content of the speech? That is, what is the patient talking about frequently? Is he or she repeating a phrase or a sentence or a word repeatedly, saying the same thing again and again? Preoccupied with some theme, so you might want to make a note of that. Are there any speech defects such as dysarthria, dysphonia, dysphasia? Is there aphasia, which is completely loss of speech? Most of these will be associated with organic conditions where either the brain or some other organ is affected. Dysarthria is when the muscles of articulation are affected, such as the tongue and the palate. So you will get a slurred speech. Dysphonia is when the organs of phonation are affected, such as the vocal cords. The air flow across the vocal cords may be affected. Vocal cords may be paralyzed due to recurrent laryngeal nerve palsy. Dysphasia is when the brain is affected. Speech centers in the brain are affected, aphasia or dysphasia. And according to whether it's receptive or motor, you can call it receptive aphasia or motor aphasia. As you probably know, there are two broad main speech areas. Receptive, which is Wernicke's area, and motor, which is Broca's area. Then speech or reflective of thoughts. Okay, you think first and then you speak, usually. So speech reflects nothing but the underlying thought. So that the thought also considered under three headings: thought stream, thought form, and thought content. Thought stream includes, again, how free-flowing the thought is. Is it flowing like a river, or is it very halted, or is it guarded? Or does the patient have thought block, wherein the patient begins to talk about something and then suddenly abruptly stops? Thought block, which can happen in schizophrenia. Excessive thoughts bombarding the mind of the patient can be seen in mania. Thought form is, whatever the patient is saying or thinking, does it make sense? Or the two thoughts connected to each other? Does one thought give rise logically to the next thought? Or is there a difference? Are they totally unconnected? Is he going off in tangents, called tangentiality in speech? Is he being very circumstantial, which means he's including unnecessary details in the speech? Is he making any grammatical errors? Is he making any non-grammatical errors which make no sense? Is he coining new terminologies? Or is the speech so hopelessly mixed that it all feels very, very senseless? Sometimes called verbigeration or word salad, which may occur in schizophrenia. So disorders of thought forms, or also called formal thought disorder, is one of the features of schizophrenia, and also mania. In mania, you might have rhyming. Patient may suddenly start reciting a poem with a lot of rhyming words, clanging. All these things can be seen in mania. Thought content is, what is the patient thinking about? What is the content of his thoughts? What is the predominant theme that is occupying his mind? That is thought content. So thought content may include something like called an overvalued idea, wherein the same idea is repeated or given too much prominence. Overvalued, preoccupied with that idea. One step above overvalued idea is delusion, which is by definition firm, fixed, false belief in spite of evidence to the contrary. It is firm, fixed, and it is false. Yet the patient keeps on believing it to be true, even though you tell the patient, or even though you provide proof to the patient that it is not true. I am being haunted, I am being followed by people, they are trying to harm me, the patient may say. You might say, that's not true because you are living with your family, and I've already asked your family, they say there is nobody behind you. It is just the feeling that you have. No, doctor, I'm certain that somebody is trying to harm me. So it's firm and fixed and false. And even though you present the evidence, patient still continues to believe in it. That is delusion. May be seen in thought content. Phobias may be present in thought content. Phobia is a type of anxiety disorder, right? Phobia, by the way, is irrational fear out of proportion to the threat. That's what it is. Obsessions, which are part of obsessive compulsive disorder, may be present in thought content, which is recurrent thoughts which keep coming back to the patient's mind even though he or she tries to block the thoughts. Patient may be highly anxious, so anxiety may affect his thought content. He may be filled the thought content may be full of anxious thoughts about the future, about his health. So hypochondriacal thoughts, which is fear of having some major underlying illness, that is hypochondriacal thought. So this thought content may be different from person to person, and it's for you to find out what is preoccupying the patient, his thoughts. And don't forget that in a patient with depression, very important, thought content may be suicidal ideas. So that is also a part of thought content. And you have to find that out. Suicidal thoughts, deliberate self-harm thoughts, if present, should be recorded under thought content. Affect and mood. Do you know the difference? Affect is the outer expressive changes that you see, which changes according to the situation or circumstance. For example, if I tell you a joke, you'll laugh, right? You'll smile or you'll laugh. So the outward expression that I see on your face is affect, and that changes according to the situation. If you are attending a funeral, you will look very sad. So that's your affect at that time. The affect changes according to the situation, but still we talk about something called labile affect, wherein the affect keeps on changing from sad to angry to happy to anxious or whatever. So that could be seen in mania or in schizophrenia. We also talk about stable affect, which means the affect is fairly stable over a period of time and not frequently changing, as in labile affect. What is mood then? Mood is the underlying emotional state which does not change a lot according to external situation. It is somewhat pervasive. That means it is present at all times. And even if you tell a joke to a depressed person, the person will still be feeling sad with it. The affect may change temporarily, but the person is still very depressed deep within. So that is mood. Right? So it could be anxious mood, it could be angry or irritable mood, it could be low mood or depressed mood, it could be hypomanic or manic mood, where it's the opposite of depression, highly elated and happy for no reason. So mood can be subjective and objective. You need to ask both. How are you feeling from within? So that will be the subjective, what the patient tells you. Objective is what you make out looking at the patient and examining the patient. What do you think is the underlying emotional state of the patient? So that is also important. Mood can be subjective and objective. Both you have to record. The affective incongruence may be seen. The affect may be incongruent. Laughing at a funeral is very incongruent, isn't it? If I tell you a joke, you look sad. Instead of laughing, you look sad. So that is affective incongruence, the opposite of the expected effect. So that can be seen in schizophrenia. Perceptions means what you experience through your sense organs. That's what it is. There are 5 sense organs, right? Eyes, nose, ear, tongue, skin. Therefore, you have perceptions such as vision, audition or auditory, olfactory, gustatory, and tactile. Each of these can have abnormalities. Broadly, there are 2 types of perceptual abnormalities seen in psychiatry. One is illusion and the other one is hallucination. Illusion by definition is false perception of a normal stimulus. Hallucination, on the other hand, is false perception in the absence of stimulus. A classic example is a rope lying in the darkness. You see a coiled rope and you think that is a snake. So what is that? That is an illusion, isn't it? False perception of a normal stimulus. The stimulus, rope is normally lying there, but you think it is a snake. So that is an illusion. On the other hand, there is nothing there, and still you are seeing a coiled snake. That is a hallucination. In the absence of stimulus, if you are perceiving something there, that is hallucination. Illusions may be normal also. It can happen to you and I. If you are walking in the darkness and suddenly you see a rope, you might mistake it to be a snake, right? Whereas hallucinations are not normal, they are almost always abnormal. So, depending on the perception, type of perception, you can have all these hallucinations. You can have visual hallucinations. The example that I just gave, seeing things that are not there. So visual hallucinations, seeing things which are not there, that can be seen in usually organic conditions such as brain abnormalities, such as encephalopathies, alcohol withdrawal state, dementia, delirium. These may be associated with visual hallucinations. Very rarely it can be seen in schizophrenia also, but in schizophrenia more common is auditory hallucinations, such as hearing voices. But that's a classic example for auditory hallucinations. What about gustatory hallucinations, taste-related hallucinations? Where would you get those? It is very rare, okay, gustatory hallucinations. It is more probably a neurological condition, like for example, if there are any cranial nerve abnormalities, especially sensory supply cranial nerve lesions, you may have gustatory hallucinations. What about olfactory hallucinations? Smelling something even though the source of the smell is not there. The classic example for this is temporal lobe epilepsy. You feel as though you're smelling burnt rubber or something just before having a temporal lobe seizure. Sometimes you can also have olfactory hallucinations in people with schizophrenia also. Frontal lobe damage can also be associated with it. Tactile hallucinations, feeling as though something is crawling on your skin or under the skin. Cocaine bugs. Formication, F-O-R-M-I-C-A-T-I-O-N, formication. Rarely you can experience something called depersonalization and derealization under perceptual abnormalities. Depersonalization means the patient may feel as though his body or body part is changing in shape, form or color. Suddenly the hand may appear very tiny or microscopic, or his body may appear to have turned orange or green or whatever. On the other hand, derealization is when the same thing happens to the surroundings, the external world around the patient. Either people or objects appear to have been altered in shape, form or color. That is derealization. You get this in extreme anxiety attacks such as panic disorder, panic attacks. You can experience these perceptual changes wherein the patient may feel he or she or the world has significantly altered, happens during the attack. So those are perceptual abnormalities that you might want to record. So here we are. Next is cognition, that is higher mental functions. You record higher mental functions in neurological examination, right? CNS examination. So it is somewhat similar to that. Consciousness, whether the person is alert, aware, drowsy, semi-comatose, sleeping, all these things would come under consciousness. Person in delirium may have fluctuating consciousness, in and out of sleep or drowsiness, whereas dementia, clear consciousness. That is the difference between them. Attention and concentration. Is the person able to focus, understand what you are asking? focus on the point that he or she is trying to make. If you give him a task to do, like a simple mathematical problem, is he able to concentrate and solve the problem? So all these will be attention and concentration, which may be highly distracted in conditions such as mania, schizophrenia, dementia, and all those things. Orientation to time, place, and person. This is in order. Time first, then place, then last person. Does the patient know what time it is, what time of the day it is, what is the date, day of the week, month, year? That is time. Season. Place. Does he or she know which place it is, which city, which house? And the person. Can the person recognize his family members or not? So this is lost in order. First time, then place, then person, which can be seen in dementia, right? Disorientation is seen in dementia and delirium. Memory is of two types, short-term and long-term memory. Short-term is more immediate, that whatever you learned in the last few hours or so, that is short-term memory. If you shift that memory from short-term into the long-term memory, it becomes like a permanent memory, and that is known as long-term memory. And that classically includes autobiographical memory, that is, details from the patient's past, such as what year did he get married, what courses he has done, which college he attended, those sort of things. Short-term memory and long-term memory. Both may be affected depending on the condition. Short-term memory loss is seen in dementia, whereas long-term memory also may be affected in a special type of dementia called Korsakoff's psychosis, which occurs as a consequence of long-term chronic alcohol dependence and thiamine deficiency. Falsification of long-term memory, it's known as confabulation, which is seen in Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome. Intelligence is, does the patient know about the day-to-day affairs, such as what is happening in the society, the latest news? Does he or she know who the Prime Minister of the country is? What is the capital of the state that he is living in? Is he able to solve some basic mathematical sums, puzzles? That is informally assessing somebody's intelligence. Of course, there are formal IQ tests which a psychologist will be able to do to obtain the IQ, that is intelligence quotient, for usually a child, to determine whether the child has mental retardation or no, or some form of learning disabilities, which will then be used to initiate appropriate schooling, special school or normal school or whatever, depending on the IQ score. That's different. That's more formal assessment of intelligence. But a basic assessment you can do and record in mental state examination. Judgment. What is right, what is wrong, what is safe, what is unsafe, is the patient aware of that? If a house is on fire, what are you going to do? You might want to ask. If the patient says, I'm going to sit in there and enjoy my favorite TV show, then probably lacking in judgment. If on the other hand he says, I'm going to get out of there as soon as I can and call the fire brigade, then that might indicate good judgment.
Yes.
Judgment may be impaired in dementia, schizophrenia. Insight. Insight means what does the patient know about his or her own illness? So does the patient believe that he or she is ill? Specifically to do with psychiatry, does the patient believe that he or she is mentally ill? Or does he or she think that it is some kind of medical illness which does not require any psychiatric treatment? Is the patient concerned about having this mental illness? So if the patient knows that he or she is mentally ill, is the patient willing to accept treatment for this mental illness? Or does he think that this is a trivial issue, I'm not going to bother taking any long-term psychiatric treatment, I'm not going to comply with treatment? Both are aspects of insight. One, the patient should know that he or she is mentally ill, and also should be willing to accept treatment for that particular illness. So that is full insight. If any of these is lacking, it is called partial insight. That means if a patient believes he or she is mentally ill but refuses treatment, that is partial insight. On the other hand, if a patient says that I am not mentally ill, but because the family is telling and you are also advising, I will take your treatment, no problem. That is also partial insight. Total lack of insight may be seen when both are absent. That means patient believes that he or she is not mentally ill and also refuses to take treatment. That is full loss of insight, which is seen in psychotic condition. Remember, we have a division of neurosis and psychosis. It is seen in major mental illnesses such as psychotic illnesses, especially schizophrenia, mania, and also in other conditions such as delirium and dementia also. Delusional disorders, all these conditions, insight is completely absent. But if the psychotic condition improves gradually, the patient may move on from no insight to at least partial insight, where he will say, I know I'm not ill, but I'll take your treatment. And during full recovery period, the patient will have full insight. I know of so many patients who are in remission, who will come to follow up and say, that period when I was ill, I don't know what I was thinking. I was not myself. I had lost my sense of judgment. I believed I was not ill. But now I recognize that it was all wrong. And I'm happy to continue taking the treatment. So that is full insight. But during acute phases of illness, insight will be lost. The mental state examination ends with insight. Okay. But I usually add this extra element called risk, just to be thorough with our mental state examination. So based on the history that you have taken and the mental state examination that you have done so far, you should be able to tell what kind of a risk the patient poses to himself or to others. So therefore, you have various types of risks such as risk to self, others, neglect, abuse, or any specific risks pertaining to that particular condition. Risk to self means suicidal thoughts or deliberate self-harm thoughts. Is a person a suicide risk? That's what it means by self, risk to self. Risk to others means homicidal thoughts, such as trying to harm anybody. It could be another person or it could be the person's property or belongings. So that could be risk to others also. Risk to self is suicidal thoughts, risk to others is homicidal thoughts. Risk of neglect is the person able to take care of himself or herself because of the underlying condition. For example, schizophrenia. He or she may neglect to attend to activities of daily living, may neglect to eat and drink, may neglect to take medication at the right time, may neglect to come for follow-up. So that is all part of neglect, may be seen with somebody who is living alone, especially with schizophrenia or with dementia.
Yes.
Risk of abuse is the patient likely to be abused by somebody, usually a child. Is the child living in a very unsafe environment where the child is at risk of being abused? Or is the patient that you are seeing likely to abuse somebody else? That can also happen. So you need to consider both the situations. So it's not just child abuse, it can also be elder abuse, especially elder patients who are living in care homes or something. They may be abused by the staff themselves. That can also happen. Or they may be abused by relatives, not caring for them, who are usually after their property, threatening them to make a will in their name, those sort of things. That can also be part of abuse. And specific risk means it depends on the condition. For example, in mania, there may be a specific risk of overspending. A person with mania may go about from mall to mall making expensive purchases because mental state is not stable and may end up in debt. A person with alcohol driving after drinking, there is a specific risk of drink driving and having accidents under alcohol dependence, is it not? Person with dementia roaming around in the house and falling down and having a fracture of the hip or something. So that is a specific risk for dementia, or opening the door in the middle of the night and going away and getting lost, risk of absconsion. That is a specific risk in dementia, depending on the condition. So this is how you categorize risk and write it down for that particular patient, for that particular condition, at that particular point of time. Everything is important because the risk changes from time to time. So that's why every time you see a patient, you have to make this assessment of risk. Is the patient's mental condition stable enough for me to send him home with medications, or is there a risk that he might take an overdose of the medications that I am prescribing and end up committing suicide or harming himself? That's a risk assessment I have to do every time I see the patient. So finally, after the history and mental state examination, and if necessary, physical examination also, usually we do that also, you end up with making a provisional diagnosis or a differential diagnosis if you are less certain. Provisional means not a definitive diagnosis, not a final diagnosis. For example, you might just want to say it's a mood disorder, most probably depression, because it could be dysthymia also, which you might decide upon at a later time. Because you don't have to conclude your full examination in one setting. In psychiatry, the assessment may take several sittings for you to complete, especially if you are seeing somebody with personality disorders. You can't make up your mind straight away. You might need several sittings and assessments before you draw your conclusions. So until such a time, you can have a provisional diagnosis or a differential diagnosis. Differential diagnosis may include things like psychosis, probably drug-induced, or functional illness like schizophrenia or a delusional disorder. A list of differential diagnoses. And as I told you, for etiological formulation, you have to do for every patient, especially during case presentation, biopsychosocial, predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating, and protective factors. Predisposing is something that is already there and which makes the illness to appear. Precipitating is the immediate trigger for the illness. Perpetuating is what makes the illness to continue even while taking treatment. Protective is what prevents the illness from occurring. All these under biological, psychological, and social headings you will have to consider and write down the formulation table for that particular patient, for that particular condition at that particular point of time.